If you got a Bible with you, Mark chapter 2 is where we're going to be at this morning. Hey, man, before we get into that, man, don't y'all love Sisto, who's up here doing the welcome? Man, give Sisto a hand. Awesome. If you don't know or haven't heard more of his story, just recently retired, 30-something years as a sergeant at the sheriff's department, and this next phase of his life feels called to pastoral ministry, and so he's been serving as a pastoral intern here at the church for the last 5 months or so. So just such an awesome guy, such a blessing to be around. I do kind of have a bone to pick though, and I've told Sisto this. We've unpacked this in staff meeting, but man, every time we get Sisto to come up here and do the welcome, you guys are pumped up and excited and cheering and clapping and are all into it. And then the weeks I get up here and do the welcome, it's crickets. And it's I told Sis, I'm man, I don't know, you're making me feel pretty insecure here. I don't know what's up with that. So anyways, instead of going and paying for a counselor this week, I figured I'd just get that off my chest with you guys and save a few bucks. But all right, Mark chapter 2, if you're new with us, we're just walking through the Gospel of Mark. And so we're picking up in chapter 2, verse 18. So I'm going to ask you a question real quick. Now, I hate it when I'm somewhere at church or wherever and a speaker asks a question that could easily be a rhetorical question, but he tells you to raise your hand and participate. I hate that, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway, all right? So how many of you would admit that you're a person who loves tradition? If you like traditions, raise your hand. Come on, lift it up. Be proud. It's okay. If you like traditions, raise your hand. Yeah, okay, so I think probably most of you. Here's what I've learned about myself recently. If you would have asked me a while back, I would have said, man, I absolutely despise tradition. And I think part of the reason is some baggage from growing up. I grew up in church, and in the church I grew up in, there was all this fighting and bickering going on, and all the fighting and bickering was over tradition, over the way the church had always done things. And it wasn't over, important stuff like doctrine or theology or what does the Bible actually teach. It was over all of these preferential things. So there's all this fighting and bickering over, well, what should the music sound like in church? What, should the church building look like? What should you wear to church? Should you dress more formally or more casually? And so there's all this dividing and arguing over these. And so you had, one group who would say, well, this is how we've always done things here, so this is how we need to keep doing things here. And then you had another group who would say, yeah, well, but the things that were effective at reaching people in the 70s and 80s aren't going to be effective at reaching people today. And so there's all this fighting and arguing and division. And so I saw that as a kid, the people of God just fighting over all these preferential things, fighting over tradition. And it just left this bad taste in my mouth where for the longest time I would have said, man, I absolutely abhor tradition. And then recently, here's what I've started to realize. I don't hate tradition. I just hate other people's traditions. Or I've started to realize, actually, I'm very fond of the traditions that I like. For example, I grew up, born and raised a South Carolina Gamecock fan. So, if you go to an SEC football game in Columbia, South Carolina on a cool fall night, what's going to happen is the team is going to come out to the best entrance in college football. They come out to 2001 Space Odyssey. So check this out. Literal chills. If you could see close, tears coming down my face. Now, if you're hey, I didn't think South Carolina was any good at football. We're not. But we have the best entrance in college football. All right, so here's the deal. I love that, man. Again, I literally have chills on my arm right now. So if South Carolina ever tries to change that tradition, they are getting a strongly worded email from me. It's probably not going to get read. It'll get deleted, but whatever. I'm sending that email because I love that tradition. I love it. Like another one, as a kid, every year when we would get out the Christmas tree and decorate the Christmas tree, my mom would make sausage balls. You all know what sausage balls are? Right? If you don't, it's like you take some Bisquick, take some shredded cheese, some sausage, form it into a little ball and bake it. And so every year, decorating the tree, we would have sausage balls as we decorated the tree. And so I love that tradition. And so now I've kind of adopted that with my kids. Every year when we decorate the tree, I make this big batch of sausage balls. Now, I'll be honest. At this point in my life, I don't even really like sausage balls. Every year I think I'm going to, I'm like, oh, they're so great. And then I make them like, this isn't that good. Like they're dry, they're kind of bland. I don't even love them anymore. But I love the tradition, like the nostalgia. I just eat it up. Like another one around Christmas, every year in church as a kid for our Christmas Eve service, that service every year would end with us lighting candles and singing Silent Night. Right? And so I grew to love that tradition. One, because it meant like, hey, as a kid in church, I get to play with fire. And I thought that was pretty awesome. But two, I knew every year when that candle gets lit and we sing Silent Night, that means, hey, Christmas is officially here. Like that was the last memory I would have before Christmas morning. And so I love that kind of nostalgic feeling of lighting the candles and singing Silent Night on Christmas Eve. And so you better believe, as long as God allows me to serve as a pastor, on Christmas Eve, we're going to end every Christmas Eve service by lighting candles and singing Silent Night. That's just what we're going to do. Amen. Yeah, hey. Yeah, some of y'all love that. That's how we're going to end Christmas Eve service. Now, is there some big, deeper, more meaningful theological reason behind that? I have no idea. I don't care. I just love the tradition. Like, I love it. It just makes me feel all warm and fuzzy and awesome inside. And so I've kind of shifted. I've changed where now I've learned, hey, tradition is not a bad thing. Tradition is a good thing. Tradition is a beautiful thing. But what we're going to see in our text today is that sometimes our traditions can cease to do what they were intended to do in the first place. All right, does that make sense? Sometimes a tradition can stop doing what the tradition meant to do and meant to accomplish in the first place. So again, that tradition of the Gamecocks running out to 2001 Space Odyssey, what its intention is to get the crowd fired up, to get everybody excited so that they're into the game, so that they're loud at kickoff. That's what it was meant to do. But if there comes a time where everybody just gets bored with it and it's stale and nobody enjoys it anymore and it doesn't get everybody excited, it doesn't do what it was intended to do, then maybe it's time to move on to a new tradition. Or here's one for us as a church. We've kind of adopted this tradition lately where we end every service with a benediction from the book of Psalms. And the reason we do that, what that benediction is intended to do, is it reminds us that God's heart is for people of all nations to come to faith in Him. That God isn't just a God for America or for Mexico or for Nigeria or for China or wherever, that God is a God whose heart is for people of all the nations of the world to come to Him. And it reminds us that God blesses us in order that we should be sent out to be a blessing, to go and take the gospel to the nations. So that benediction reminds us as we leave each Sunday that we are sent to be a blessing by carrying the gospel to the nations. That's its purpose. That's why we do it. Now, here's the deal. If at some point, and this will happen eventually, that tradition becomes stale and routine, and we all get to the point where we're just saying the words without really thinking and processing what they mean or what the purpose behind those words are, then, well, hey, it's probably time to move on to a new tradition at that point because it would have lost its intended purpose. So again, what we're going to see in this text, we're really looking at two stories back to back in the Gospel of Mark today. What we're going to see is that there are some religious folks in Jesus' day who were big on a couple traditions. They were really big, really in favor of a couple of different religious traditions. But what Jesus is going to show them is, hey, your traditions and the way you are viewing them are no longer serving their intended purpose like they were meant to. So we're going to pick it up in Mark 2, verse 18. And hey, just by the way, apologies to you guys. I haven't had a voice all week. It's kind of started to come back. So if it starts cracking and it's annoying for you guys, I apologize. My wife does kind of like the low, sultry sort of thing. So that's good for me. But again, you guys have to listen to it. So I'm sorry for you. But Mark 2, verse 18, this is what it says. It says, once when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and asked, "Why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do?" Jesus replied, "Do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. They can't fast while the groom is with them, but someday the groom will be taken away from them and then they will fast. Besides, who would patch old clothing with a new cloth? For the new patch would shrink and rip away from the old cloth, leaving an even bigger tear than before. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the wine would burst the wineskins, and the wine and skins would both be lost. New wine calls for new wineskins. So this first story, some folks come up to Jesus, and these people who come up to Jesus, they are big on the spiritual discipline of fasting. They are very much in favor of the spiritual discipline of fasting. Now, real quick, here's what fasting is spiritually. When the Bible talks about fasting, it's not like a weight loss thing. You know, intermittent fasting is like really big, and you know, from everything I've read, it seems like intermittent fasting is really good for you, really healthy and all that, but that's not what it's talking about here. Fasting in a biblical perspective, spiritual fasting is where you refrain from food for a certain amount of time in order to pursue God more fully, most often through prayer. So you refrain from food in order to pursue God more deeply or more fully. And so it's this act where you give up this thing, food, this thing that you need in order to survive, right? We have to have food to survive. But you give that thing up for a temporary period of time as a way of saying, God, even more than I need food to survive, God, I need you. I need your word. I need your presence even more than that if I'm going to survive. And so, listen, whenever you're in a season of life, maybe where you got a big decision coming up, or you're seeking after God, you're trying to discern what his will is. Or maybe you're in a season of life where it's just a spiritually dry season. Hey, we all have those spiritually dry seasons. Maybe when you're in one of those seasons, you don't feel God's presence like you once did. Maybe a good practice for you is to fast. You give up food as a way to pursue deeper intimacy with God. So that's what fasting is in a nutshell. And so listen, just real quick, if you're a follower of Jesus and you have never fasted, maybe give it a try. But here's the thing to remember. If you fast, it's not going to make God love you anymore. Okay, you are already fully loved through the righteousness of Jesus. You're already fully loved. You can't be loved any more than you already are by God if you are in Christ. So fasting is not going to make God love you anymore. It's not going to make you a quote-unquote better Christian. But it is a beautiful practice and a beautiful discipline that can help us experience God's presence in a deeper, in a new, or in a different kind of way. And so if you've never done it before, hey, start small. Maybe just pick a day. Say, God, Wednesday I'm going to fast. I'm going to refrain from solid food as a way to spend more time in prayer, as a way to pursue you more fully. So fasting, it's a beautiful, wonderful spiritual discipline. But here's what's happening in this story. These religious guys, they come up to Jesus and they basically say, hey, Jesus, all of us good religious folks fast. And we all fast often, like we make it a practice to be kind of regimented and routine about it. But Jesus, we've noticed that your followers, your disciples don't actually fast. Now, here's one thing you got to understand. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of the people who are coming to Jesus and asking this question, they don't fast to genuinely seek after God. The reason they fast is to check the box of their religious tradition. They're fasting to check that religious box. They think that doing so makes them closer to God. But more importantly, because Jesus talks about them later, they're fasting so that people will see them and look at them and say, oh, look how pious, look how holy, look how righteous those people are. Man, they fast, they sacrifice so much for God. So they're not doing this for the right reasons, a lot of these people, but still they come up to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, well, we fast. We're good, followers of God. We're doing all the things. We're practicing all the disciplines. We fast. Why don't your followers fast? And Jesus says something interesting. He says, well, does the wedding guests fast when they are celebrating with the groom? Right? And the rhetorical answer to that question is no, of course not. Like you go to a wedding and at the celebration, you don't fast, you eat. You feast, you celebrate with the groom at that wedding reception. That's kind of the rhetorical answer to Jesus' question here. But here's the deeper meaning of what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is trying to communicate to them is he's saying, hey guys, the purpose of fasting, the reason you fast in the first place is to pursue closeness with God. Right? The reason you fast is to pursue intimacy with God. So Jesus is saying, so hey, you guys, you want to know why my disciples don't fast? Because breaking news, I am God, and they already have my presence every day when I am with them. Right? That's what Jesus is saying to them. He said, my disciples don't need the tradition of fasting to be close to God because I am God who has come and has already drawn near to them. So it'd be pointless for them to fast. See, because again, for the people asking this question, in their tradition, if you felt distant from God, then you would fast. But Jesus saying, hey boys, it's a new day. God is doing a new thing. Through me, God has come. So if fasting is meant to bring you closer to God, why in the world would my disciples need to fast when they already have the presence of God through me? Jesus saying a new day has arrived with my coming, with my incarnation. And then to illustrate kind of this point of how Jesus is doing something new, he uses this, it's kind of a weird analogy for us, but this analogy of using a new piece of cloth on an old garment and putting new wine into old wineskins. But here's kind of the picture there. What Jesus is saying is, with this clothing analogy, like basically, hey, if your tunic, if you tear a hole in your tunic, you've been wearing that tunic for a couple months now, so the fabric in that tunic has already shrunk. Right, we all get this, right? You wash a shirt a couple times, and then it comes up and turns into a belly shirt, and you're like, what in the world has happened here? It's the most annoying thing ever, right? But our clothes, how they shrink. The fabric, kind of constricts and shrinks. It was the same with their fabric. So Jesus is saying, if you rip a hole in your tunic, but it's an old tunic, well, that tunic has already compressed and shrunk. So if you go and you get a brand new piece of cloth, and you cut it to the size of that hole and try to patch it with that new piece of cloth, well, over time, that new piece of cloth is going to constrict and shrink. And when it does, the tunic won't shrink with it because it's already shrunk. And so then the threads are going to tear, and you're going to have another hole on your tunic. And then it's the same thing with this wine and new wineskins. What would happen in this day is you would make wine, and that new wine that's newly being made, you would put it into a fresh leather skin. Because when leather was new and it was fresh, it was pliable, right? It could expand and contract and move. It had pliability to it. And so you would put new wine into new leather because that new wine, as it's sitting in there, would continue to ferment. That's how they would do it. It would ferment in that skin. And as the wine would ferment, it would expand, but with the new leather, it's pliable, and so it can expand with that wine. But if you take that new wine and you put it into an old dry leather skin, well, that skin is already expanded fully. It's not pliable anymore. It's not going to move anymore. So if you fill an old wine skin up with new wine, then, well, as that new wine begins to ferment and expand, it's going to make the old wineskin explode. It won't expand with it. Right? And so here's what Jesus is saying with those two analogies. See, again, he's saying, hey, guys, I am doing something completely new here. I have come to do something completely new. He's telling these deeply committed religious folks, he's saying, hey guys, don't try to mingle your old religious traditions. Don't try to think in the context of your old religious ways with this new thing that I'm doing, because they are not going to fit together. See, here's the worldview in the context that a lot of these Pharisees, that a lot of these religious leaders were coming at Jesus with. Their mindset was, well, the way that we are brought close to God, the way we draw near to God is by our adherence to the religious law. Right? All the commands of the Old Testament, the way that we become close with God is we do a good job of following all those commands to the best of our ability. That's in their minds how they thought they would draw near to God. What Jesus is saying is, hey guys, no. That is the old way. But the new way is I have come to draw people close to God. You're not going to get near to God by your adherence to the religious law. You're going to get near to God through me. See, here's the big idea that Jesus is getting at here. What he is reminding us of is that traditions can't bring us close to God. Okay, again, traditions are good. Traditions are beautiful. Traditions are helpful. We'll talk about that in a minute. But traditions and following traditions can't bring us closer to God. Only Jesus brings us closer to God the Father. So what can traditions do? Traditions can help us. Traditions can teach us. Traditions can form us. Traditions can remind us. Traditions can point us to greater truths. But by following those traditions, we aren't brought any closer to God. Those traditions have to point us to Jesus, who brings us closer to God. So think about this, traditions, especially kind of in our context, when we talk about religious traditions or spiritual traditions or traditions in the church, what they should do is, what traditions are meant to do is to always point us to the gospel, to remind us that Jesus lived a perfect life. He died on the cross for our sin. He rose from death in order to bring us to God. And it reminds us that we don't draw near to God by following those traditions. We draw near to God by following Christ. It's Jesus who brings us near to God, not the traditions. So that's the point of this first story. So what Mark's going to do is he's going to then kind of sandwich that back to back with another story that is going to illustrate the same point. So Mark immediately goes on in verse 23. This is apparently another day. Mark says, "Then one Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees, those same religious leaders, the Pharisees said to Jesus, 'Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?' But Jesus said to them, 'Haven't you ever read in the scriptures?'" By the way, Jesus is hilarious. Like, we miss it, like in our language and cultural context, we miss like a lot of the innuendo here. But like these Pharisees, these are the most smart Old Testament scholars in the world. They would have had the majority of the Old Testament memorized, right? And Jesus says to them, hey guys, have you not read that story of David in the Old Testament? Like, this is such an insult that would have made them so angry. It's hilarious. But Jesus says, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" Like, guys, you missed that story in Sunday school? Come on, you're supposed to know it all. He says he went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was the high priest, and he broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." Here's the backstory here. In the Old Testament, God has commanded his people to take one day off of work a week. It's called the Sabbath, right? And by the way, just think about that. How amazing and kind and loving and beautiful is our God that he actually commands us to rest. He says, hey, just take a day and chill out. Take it easy and rest. Man, that is an awesome God that we serve. But that was called the Sabbath, this day to rest. And part of that is that God has wired it into our DNA that we need that day of rest. You need that day of rest. If you keep going and going and going without that day of rest, your body, it's going to catch up to you and you're going to be forced to take a day of rest. Right? We can't just keep running. Right? We have to rest. It's wired into our DNA. God wired it into our DNA. But he did that in part, it's a way to teach us to rely on God, that, hey, I can cease from work for a day because ultimately God's going to provide for my needs. It teaches us to rely on God, and it teaches us to rest in God. So that's why there's this command of the Sabbath. But see, the religious folks in Jesus' day, they turned the blessing of the Sabbath into a burden because they added all of these man-made traditions on top of that simple command to stop and rest. So instead of just being a simple command, stop, take a day off, and rest, they added literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things you could not do on the Sabbath on top of it. And of course, one of those, as you probably guessed, is you can't pluck grain on the Sabbath. So that's the backstory. So here, one day, Jesus and disciples, they're walking through a grain field. The disciples get hungry. It's the middle of the day. And as they're walking through this grain field, they pluck some of the heads of grain. They toss it in their mouth. And some of these religious leaders see this. They're watching. And they freak out. They say, y'all are criminals. You're breaking the law. Our traditions say that you cannot harvest grain on the Sabbath. And look again at verse 27, what Jesus says. It says, Jesus says to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." What Jesus is saying there is, guys, no, God gave you the Sabbath so that you can find peace and rest in him. That's why he gave it. But you've turned it into a burden and into a chore because of your traditions. And then the next verse, Jesus makes this bold statement. He says, so the Son of Man, he's talking about himself. He's saying, I am Lord even over the Sabbath. Here's what he's saying there. He's saying the Sabbath was supposed to help you find your rest in God. But hey guys, here's some breaking news again. I am that God that you are to find your rest in. The Sabbath is ultimately meant to point you to me so that you find your rest in me. And so again, here's kind of the big idea. Here's the key of what Jesus is ultimately getting at and teaching here. He's saying, hey guys, these traditions that you have been participating in, they're good things. Keep doing them, like the fasting, the Sabbath. Yes, Jesus would say, I'm a fan of those. But Jesus is saying, these traditions you're participating in, they were ultimately meant to point you to me. They were ultimately meant to lead you to me. But in failing to see who I am, man, you are missing the purpose of those traditions altogether. Right, that's what Jesus is trying to communicate to these religious leaders. And so, again, the problem with the traditions was that in their observance of the traditions, what they were thinking is they thought, well, I observe this tradition because when I observe this tradition, God will be pleased with me for my observance of the tradition, and thus I will be closer to God. So they observe the Sabbath only because they think in doing so it will make God pleased with them. They give up food to be pious, to be self-righteous and fast because they think in doing so it will make God pleased with them. It was all about what they were doing. It was all about their religious effort, their religious work. But Jesus said, no, guys, I have come to bring you to God, so just trust in me. Just rest in me. Your observance to the religious law, your observance to all your traditions of your ancestors, they can be good. They can be beautiful. They can be right. But ultimately, they were meant to point you to me. So come find your rest and peace in me. And so, for us, as we think about this, traditions, and again, specifically spiritual and religious traditions, like in our context as a church, they are beautiful and they are wonderful, so long as they remind us of the gospel. Our traditions are good and beneficial and helpful as long as they point us to that good news that when we were separated from God because of our sin, God sent his son Jesus to live a perfect life, to die for our sin, to rise from death, so that through his death and resurrection, anyone who puts their faith in him could be forgiven and have relationship with him forever, right? That's what our tradition should do. It should point us to that good news and remind us of that good news. But see, the moment we get this religious mindset like the religious people in this passage had, the moment we get that mindset where we start to think, well, it's by my adherence to the tradition that makes God pleased with me, we've lost the point altogether. Whenever we start to think, well, I do all these things, I follow all these traditions, I obey all these rules so that God will accept me. No, that's not the gospel. That's a false gospel. We've lost the point. But when traditions serve to point us back to Jesus, to remind us of the good news of the gospel, they're beautiful and good and helpful. So again, just when we think of traditions and religious traditions, they are not a bad thing. But ultimately, they point us to Jesus that our hope is in. Our hope is in Jesus, not in our traditions. These religious folks in these stories, they're putting their hope in their traditions. They think, I've got to do this, I've got to do that because our ancestors have always done it. That's the tradition. And so if I do this, God will be pleased with me. And Jesus said, no, I've come to bring a new day. It's no longer about what you do. It's about what I will do in your place. As we close in John chapter 1, verse 12, this is speaking about Jesus. And this is what it says. This is such beautiful good news. Listen to this. John writes and he says, but to all who believed in him, talking about Jesus, to all who believed in Jesus and accepted him, God gave the right to become children of God. John says, to all who believed in Jesus and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. So think about the traditions that the religious folks on these stories are practicing. First, they're practicing the tradition of fasting. What is the purpose of fasting? To draw nearer to God. Hey, do you want to be close to God? You want to be close to God the Father? Nothing is closer to a father than a child. Right? There's no relationship closer to a father than a child. If you want intimacy with God, you need to be a child of God. And what John says, hey, to all who believed in Jesus, to all who accepted him, he gave the right to become a child of God. Not to all who fast, Not to all who obey all the rules, not to all who practice the Sabbath, he gave the right. No, to all who believed in Jesus and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. Hey, you want to rest in the peace and in the provision of God? Hey, who is provided for more fully than a child, right? I've got to provide for my 4 children, right? That's my duty. That's my responsibility. I can't wait till they're 18 and, man, I don't have to do that anymore. It's going to be great, man. I'm going to save so much money, counting down the days. I love them, but, man, they're expensive, right? But see, as a father now and there in my house, man, it's my duty. It's my responsibility to provide for my children because I am their father. A father must provide for his children. And so, hey, you want to rest in God. You want to know that when you stop working, you have a Father in heaven who is working on your behalf, who is providing for you, who cares about you and your needs. Well, you need to be a child. You need to be the child of God the Father. And again, what John says here, he doesn't say, hey, but to all who observe the Sabbath faithfully, he gave the right to become children of God. That's not the good news. The good news is, but to all who believed in Jesus and accepted him, that's who he gave the right to become children of God. Come on, get excited about that. You can get excited about that, church. To all who believe in Jesus, all who accept him as Lord and Savior, that's who he gives the right to become children of God. That's the new thing that Jesus has come to bring into this world. That it's not about our religious observation. It's not about how well we do or don't follow all the rules. The way that we know we are children of God is by grace, by putting our faith in Jesus. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. Let's pray.